Good morning and welcome to Bible Study Live. My name's Colin Points. I'm the pastor of Winslow Christian Fellowship, and this is Bible Study Live, where you get to watch me looking at the Bible and think about my passage, the sermon that I'm going to be preaching on Sunday. I'm monitoring here so I can see if you leave any comments in a live chat, like Louise has left a comment. Nice music. Yeah, I thought I'd introduce a theme song, so why not to open the get us going. So we're looking at the next section of Mark this morning, and this is what we're looking at. It's Mark chapter 6 verses 45 to 56. So I'm going to read that now, and then we'll start thinking about what we need to think about this and say about it. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. After leaving them, he went up on a mountainside to pray. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and he was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he went out to them, walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret and anchored there. As soon as they got out of the boat, people recognized Jesus. They ran throughout that whole region and carried the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages, towns or countryside, they placed the sick in the marketplaces. They begged him to let them touch even the edge of his cloak, and all who touched him were healed. Okay, so so this is the passage that follows on from the feeding of the 5,000, and there's a reference there where he says they had not understood about the loaves, so that goes back to that, and the passage picks up with the word immediately at the beginning, so we're following directly on ahead of that, getting into a boat, because we know that they got into a boat and crossed the lake in order to get to the solitary or desolate place where the feeding of the 5,000 took place, and now they're getting in the boat and going off to Bethsaida. But he's sending them away while he gets on the mountainside to pray. So yeah, interesting. And there seems to be a couple of sections there that thing with the storm and him walking on the water, and then you got the arrival at Gennesaret from verse 53 would be the second section, and I'm dealing with the whole lot, but I could be possible to preach on just 53 to 56 on its own, but and obviously treat 45 to 52 as one section. Just have a look. I've just read the NIV, looking at the ESV. So the ESV has a separate heading for that, Jesus heals the sick in Gennesaret. So, but anyway, I'm going to treat it as one whole section, and let's just dive in and do a verse by verse trawl. So notes. I've changed slightly the way I'm doing this, because I'm aware that how I was doing it previously, if I had a little pop-up menu, say held my mouse over a word, like this one down here, then I'd get a pop-up menu, and I noticed that when I was using window capture you wouldn't see that pop-up menu, but now I'm using display capture, so you get to see everything that's on that display. So hopefully that'll give you just a bit more, that you can see what I'm talking about and why I'm saying certain things. So we're starting with verse 45, and that's immediately made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. So there's a load going on just in that verse, isn't there? So immediately this follows on directly after the feeding of the 5,000. That event was an attempt to get some rest and food. They certainly did get food, because the disciples had the leftovers, didn't they? But did they get rest? I don't think they did. I mean, it's immediately, so they didn't have a chance to rest. Probably didn't rest because this happened immediately. Why did Jesus send the disciples off whilst he stayed behind? We know people can get there on foot to this desolate place. Because that's how 5,000 got there. So Jesus can make his own way. So Jesus would be able to make his own way home. He probably needed to be alone and refuel, but rather than sleep or eat, he needed to pray. That's the that's the priority, isn't it? That is a priority. He will give himself to others in service, even when he's exhausted or hungry. But what he really needs alone time for is prayer. I mean, he's going to need food and sleep, isn't he? But it's interesting he doesn't take the opportunity to have a sleep now. That's verse 46 that tells us about the prayer. He dismissed the crowd. So he actually sent the disciples off to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. So he's taking responsibility, isn't it? Did this after the disciples went off. Perhaps he realized the disciples had reached their limit and needed to get away. Jesus was protecting them. I'm going to take that paragraph and stick it in here just for tidiness sake. Verse 46. Because that's when he does actually pray. But he went up a mountain. That's not what. No, let's stick with the Bethsaida. Bethsaida. That's what we need to think about. Bethsaida. What do we know about Bethsaida? If we look at this tab and let that populate, presumably there'll be a map here that will give us a sense. Does that tell us where Bethsaida is? Doesn't look like it. Can't see. It's too small, this map. Right, so Bethsaida, is that on there? There it is. There's Galilee. We don't know where the lonely place was, where the desolate place was. And I don't know if that particularly helps seeing where it was, but there's the lake. Okay. What is the significance of this place? Alright, let's go on to verse 46. So it says, and after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And I've already talked about how he needed to refuel, and that was his priority. It's an important lesson for me to learn, I think. Priority of prayer. Don't think I'm the only one. Why a mountainside? Why go up on a mountain to pray? Closer to God? Seems a bit superficial to think in those terms, doesn't it? But it's Moses went up on the mountain to commune with God. Seems a bit superficial to think that being higher up would be closer to God. Possibly mirroring Moses, who went up the mountain and met with God, and he got the Ten Commandments. So yeah. Okay, verse 47. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. So evening has now come. When they fed the 5,000, we were told it was late. So is this the next evening, or is this just later on the same day? Even later. Just scroll back there and look for it in the Bible bit. Verse 35, and when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place and we need to get them some food, or they need to get some food. So let's put that reference there, Mark 6 verse 35, and then when I hover over it, it should show the verse. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him in this remote place. It's all very, very late. So that's interesting. It's difficult to figure out where we are in time. If in verse 47, when evening came, next evening perhaps, or are we just saying that when he said it was late, it's a late after lunchtime perhaps? It's helpful to get orientated in time as well as in space, geographically I mean. And the geographical, so it's very much a placing, this verse 47, getting us orientated, giving us the time when evening came, giving us the layout. The boat was out on the sea and he was alone on the land, clearly placing where everybody is. Clearly told where everyone is. Disciples on the water in the boat, Jesus on the land, all alone. So this verse is orientating us in time and place. Verse 48, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. At about the 4th watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them. Painfully. That's quite a word, isn't it? They were struggling to get where they wanted to go, and it was painful. Painfully, this word, Greek word here, basanizor, basanitzo. See why I didn't take more than 1 year of Greek. Struggled with it that much. Basanitzo, torment, beaten, suffering. Yeah. So it's a real struggle, even though a number of the disciples were experienced fishermen. The wind is the enemy here. So this recalls the events in chapter 5, I think, when they were on the lake and fear they would die because of the storm. There doesn't seem to be a fear of death. Here. But this time we don't have Jesus in the boat. So they are struggling on painfully without him. It's a picture of how many of us live, I guess, struggling on painfully without Jesus, thinking, well, if he's not with me, then he can't have any effect on me. Right? There's lessons jumping out, aren't there? Picture that many of us can relate to. Struggling painfully through life without Jesus, assuming that if we can't see him with us, then he's not with us. But Jesus could see them. And that's what matters. Not a very restful boat trip, no. No, but if it was, where would be the lesson in that, eh? It's Louise saying not a very restful boat trip, which is right. It's a good comment, but I guess that's why it's here in the Bible. If it was restful, it would just be something that happened in passing. It's getting from one place to the next, but often the journey is where the lesson is learned, and the painful journeys are where the most lessons are learned. But pain. So much life is about pain, isn't it? And I guess we're living in a society where pain is the thing to be avoided. Pain is and I guess we can do that because we know about painkillers, and we've got medications, and we've got ways and therapies of dealing all sorts of ways of avoiding pain that past generations would not have had. But have we lost the ability to learn, Tom, to learn from our pain? To see it as an opportunity to grow, to treat it as a chance to see God work. Well, I know I'd much rather take an ibuprofen most of the time than wait to see what I might be able to learn. And if you've got ibuprofen in the kitchen cupboard, well then it's too easy to take it, I guess. But of course some pain can't just be got rid of. some pains, not just the physical pains obviously, but the relationship pains, psychological pains. There's no painkiller. So they were making painful headway and the wind was against them. What's the NIV say in this verse 48? He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. So it doesn't say painfully. Yeah, interesting. I mean, one of the Greek things there, torture. It's quite an extreme word, really, it seems. Torturous. Okay, about the fourth watch of the night. What time is that? This is one of those quick answers that are commentaries are very good at thinking about. The reason that Jesus came to the disciples was the rough sea at about 3 a.m. 3 a.m, eh? So if when evening came the boat was out at sea, yeah, I suppose it must be that they got in the boat just as it was getting dark, or before it got dark. Sounds like they set off just before dark. Which means they've been at it for hours and are probably so they already they went off to this lonely place to get some rest, which they never really got, and then they've set off on the boat to get away from these crowds who needed feeding, and there's no rest in the boat. They're struggling painfully against this wind for 5-6 hours, however long it's been. Fourth watch. He came to them walking on the sea. It's interesting. He came to them walking on the sea. It's interesting. It's just normal, isn't it? It's just telling these miracles as if they're just things you do. It's another amazing miracle told as if it was just a normal thing. Probably Jesus had even said to them, "You go in the boat and I'll come later on foot." And here he is. Presumably, the fact that he saw them in trouble was why he walked out to them. But then why does it say he meant to pass them by? These funny things, when you really pay attention to these stories, details make you think, well, what? If he was going at, he'd seen they were making painful headway. He's able to just walk out there, so obviously it doesn't bother him. He's going to overtake them. It just doesn't touch him, the storm. Why does he say he meant to pass them by? Is it just to demonstrate that he's quicker than they are? Untouched by the storm. It's that thing of, you take the lift and I'll take the stairs, and when you get to the top, you know, you've run up there so you can beat the lift, and then you're kind of trying to make it look as if it were easy and trying not to breathe really hard. It's that kind of can't be that, can it? He's trying to prove himself. He's demonstrating something, presumably, that he's untouched by the storm. It is that thing of it. It's just so easy for him. He's just going out for a stroll, but actually, what he's doing is extraordinary. It's like Jesus could walk to the moon if he wanted to. Verse 49. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. They saw Jesus, and rather than being encouraged, they were terrified, thinking it was a ghost. So what? Yeah, I mean, it's you wouldn't expect to see somebody walking on water, so I guess you're just coming up with some explanation. It's the only explanation they could come up with that could make sense of the situation. Verse 50, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Terrified, tarasso. 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 Terrified, stirred, stirring, disturbed. Scrolling down. It's just example uses, isn't it? Just thinking, going back to the previous event, scrolling back to Jesus calming a storm. Just looking at verse 37, a great windstorm arose, the waves were breaking into the boat, so the boat was already filling, but he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. They woke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was great calm. And he said to them, Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? They were filled with great fear, phobos. So we've got afraid, delos, fear, phobos, said to one another, who is this then? Even the wind and the waves obey him. So delos, phobos. And then we scroll back down to Jesus walking on the water. They were terrified, which is a different word altogether, talasso. And then he says, take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Phobio, phobos again. So it's the same thing that Jesus said to them when he was asleep in the boat and there was a storm. They were scared, and Jesus' words were, don't be afraid, phobos. Okay. Verse 50, so the disciples were terrified and need reassuring. Jesus uses very similar words to the ones he reassured them with in which verse is it? Should have looked it up. Mark 4 verse 40. Reassurance was immediate. It's one of seems to be one of Mark's favourite words, immediately. Things happen one after the other. Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid. Take heart. What's that then? Take heart. So there's one word here for take heart, which is tharsio. To have courage. Have courage. Heart, take courage. Yeah. Be courageous. So be courageous because it is I. Do not be afraid. That's verse 50, verse 51. And he got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. So it's the same, some of the same parallel with chapter 4. Jesus got into the boat with them, and just like when he rebuked the wind and the waves, the storm stopped. But this time He didn't talk to them. This is, I think I made the connection with Jonah on the last one, the fact that Jonah was asleep in the boat, Jesus was asleep in the boat, but rather than chucking Jonah out of the boat in order to make the storm stop, which is what had to happen with Jonah, Jesus stayed in the boat and the storm stopped. This time, instead of Jonah being chucked out of the boat, Jesus is getting into the boat. Parallel with Jonah. Jonah had to leave the boat for the storm to stop. Jesus got in the boat and the storm stopped. But I definitely think there's something there about the fact that this is the same protection, but they weren't even aware of Jesus's being involved. They didn't know that Jesus knew, they didn't know that Jesus saw them, they didn't even know it was Jesus there. Louise asks, do you think they were more afraid of Jesus than the wind? Seems like it. They were terrified. It's quite a strong word, terrified. Whereas it's just, the wind is painful. The wind is a struggle. I mean, they might have had a sense of underlying dread, but seeing what they thought was a ghost freaked them out, I think, completely. And they were probably exhausted, so they probably thought, oh, well, you know, we'll probably be alright with this storm, but now we've seen a ghost, our days are numbered. And they were utterly astounded. So, they were astounded. Really astounded. They didn't expect to see what they saw. Jesus walking on water, and Jesus, presumably it's the walking on water that they're astounded about, or is it the calming of the storm? Is it just Jesus walking on water, or is it also the calming of the storm? And then we got this verse. For they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. They still didn't get it. They should have understood something by now, and the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 should have taught that lesson, but their astonishment shows that they're not learning. Why? Because their hearts were hardened. The block to learning was not an intellectual one. It's a spiritual block. They've seen the evidence of Jesus doing what only God can do. Feeding a mass of people in the desert with miracle bread. And yet they still haven't answered the question. That they asked back in chapter 4 when they first saw a water-based miracle. What was the verse? It was it chapter 4 verse 31? Scroll. Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Verse 41. Yeah. Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? So they asked that question after seeing Jesus calm the storm. Then other miracles, and particularly this feeding of the 5,000, that should have convinced them that Jesus is God. And so walking on water is not hard. Calming a storm when he gets into the boat, that's not hard. They shouldn't have been surprised, they shouldn't have been astounded, but they still haven't learned the lesson because there's a block, a spiritual block. It's not an intellectual block. So I could just stop there and preach that passage. Do I really want to go on to verse 53 to 56? When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored at the shore. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognised him and ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he came, in villages, cities or countryside, they laid the sick in marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. So that's people picking up on who Jesus is, what he's done. And that thing about touching the fringe of his garment is perhaps they heard about the woman who had the bleed for 12 years, who just touched his garment and she was well. See, this is where I get stuck and I think, I don't know, should I preach a sermon just on that passage? Because it doesn't seem like there's much going on there. And yet, if I believe what I say about the Bible, I could preach an entire sermon based on just these few verses here, because it's full of stuff, isn't it? And is it connected to what we've just read about? because it seems like in some ways the disciples are still shocked, but the people, they all know who Jesus is. Instinctively they know. They're coming to him, they're bringing their sick to him, they're asking for the miracles and the healings, and they're let's have a look at these verses. Verse 53. So now, there, at. Again, there's it. And moored to the shore. This is interesting. They came to land and moored at the shore. Why those details? Why the details that make the fact that they are anchored so prominent? There's a certain dynamic between land and sea going on. Jesus on the land, the disciples on the sea, the disciples in trouble. Jesus gets them to dry land. Jesus has come from dry land out to the dangerous sea and has now brought them to dry land. Again. They possibly couldn't have done it without him. You know, maybe when they were out there struggling painfully against the wind, they were starting to wonder, are we gonna survive this? Are we just gonna stay in the middle of the lake until we starve to death? Or was the storm that powerful that they could well have been swamped and sunk and drowned? Okay, verse 54. And when they got out of the boat, the people immediately recognised him. Everywhere they go by boat, they arrive and people are waiting. They recognised Jesus straight away. And then verse 55. And they ran about the whole region and began to bring the sick people on their beds to wherever they heard he was. Sick people, bring them on their beds. It's like the guy that was lowered through the roof was brought on the bed. They brought their sick to him, which is very much business as usual. Some were brought on their beds, much like the guy who was lowered down through the roof. Whereabouts was that? That was in Mark. I know it is in Luke, but to wherever he was. The whole region. So they're coming from the whole region. They're coming from the whole region to wherever Jesus was. It's kind of overwhelming. Verse 55. Verse 56. And wherever he came, in villages, cities or countryside, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and implored him that they might touch even the fringe of his garment, and as many touched it were made well. So this is a kind of summary. I think we're reaching the end of a section, that's what it is. That wherever Jesus went, people came for healing, asking him to let them touch the fringe of his garment is like the woman with a lead for 12 years. So yeah, I think these verses 53 to 56 are very much a kind of summary of the section that we've been looking at now, and it's bringing together all these themes. People have heard about it, and they've heard that he can heal people who can't walk, so they're bringing their sick on beds, and they've heard that he can even heal if you just touch the fringe of his garment. And then in chapter 7 it looks like we're getting into a new section where it's talking about the Pharisees and the scribes gathering. Obviously get into that in coming weeks. Louise says, well, like the last crowd they ran, but the result here was healings rather than teaching. That's right, isn't it? The healing of the feeding of the 5,000 he taught. Here the emphasis is on the healings. Right, so that's it. You've had an hour of it. I think that's long enough for me, long enough for you, I'm sure. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you on Sunday when you'll have a really finely crafted sermon based on this passage, I am sure.